In the crucible of the Second World War, when entire nations hung in the balance and the fate of civilization itself seemed uncertain, there emerged commanders whose very names struck terror into the hearts of their adversaries. These were men who wielded armies as instruments of their will, who understood the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, and who possessed that rare combination of tactical genius and iron determination that transforms soldiers into legends. Across burning deserts and frozen steppes, through the jungles of the Pacific and the hedgerows of Europe, their decisions shaped the course of history. Today, we examine 5 generals whose reputations were forged in the furnace of the greatest conflict humanity has ever known, men whose enemies learned to fear them and whose names still resonate with the thunder of war.
The North African desert in 1941 was a realm of infinite horizons and merciless sun, where mechanized warfare could unfold across vast expanses of sand and rock. Into this theater came a German general whose tactical brilliance would earn him a nickname that spoke to both his cunning and his elusiveness: Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Born in 1891 in Heidenheim, Germany, Rommel had already distinguished himself in the First World War, earning the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military honor, for his audacious mountain warfare in Italy. But it was in Africa where his legend would truly crystallize. Taking command of the Africa Corps in February 1941, Rommel immediately demonstrated the qualities that would make him one of the most feared commanders of the war. He understood instinctively that in desert warfare, speed and surprise were paramount. While his British opponents often fought by the book, Rommel rewrote it. What made Rommel so feared was not merely his tactical acumen, though that was formidable indeed. It was his willingness to lead from the front, to personally reconnoiter enemy positions, and to strike when his opponents least expected it. British commanders found themselves constantly wrong-footed by an adversary who seemed to materialize out of the desert wastes at the most inopportune moments. His counterattack at Cyrenaica in April 1941, executed with forces that by all conventional wisdom were insufficient for the task, threw the British Eighth Army into disarray and recaptured virtually all the territory they had won from the Italians. At Tobruk, at Gazala, and in the sweeping maneuvers that characterized the seesaw campaigns of 1941 and 1942, Rommel demonstrated an almost preternatural ability to read the battlefield. He possessed what the Germans called Fingerspitzengefühl, a fingertip feeling for warfare, an intuitive grasp of where to strike and when. His supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, constantly harassed by Allied air and naval power, yet still he achieved victories that stunned the world. Winston Churchill himself in the House of Commons felt compelled to call Rommel a great general, a tribute that sparked controversy, but spoke to the grudging respect even his enemies held for his abilities. The British soldier in North Africa knew that facing the Desert Fox meant facing an opponent who would exploit every mistake, who would turn defensive positions into launching pads for counterattacks, and who commanded with a personal courage that inspired fanatical loyalty in his troops. Yet, Rommel's story carries a complexity that deepens our understanding of these feared commanders. He was, by multiple accounts, a soldier who attempted to conduct war with honor in an honorable regime. He refused orders to execute Jewish soldiers and prisoners, treated captured enemies with dignity, and as the war progressed and Germany's defeat became inevitable, he joined the circle of officers who hoped to end the Nazi regime. His death in 1944, forced to commit suicide after the failure of the July plot against Hitler, reminds us that even amid the machinery of total war,
individual conscience could still assert itself. But in the desert, during those crucial years when Britain stood nearly alone, Rommel represented something profoundly threatening, a brilliant military mind in service to a cause that had to be stopped at all costs.
Across the Mediterranean, and later in the fields of France and the forests of Germany, another general was earning a reputation for ferocity and unrelenting aggression. George Smith Patton, Jr., known to his men as Old Blood and Guts, was born into a wealthy Californian family with deep military roots in 1885. From his earliest years, Patton believed he was destined for martial glory, and he pursued that destiny with single-minded determination. A cavalryman by training and temperament, he represented the aggressive spirit of American arms. Where some generals approached warfare as a problem to be solved through careful planning and methodical execution, Patton saw it as a test of will to be won through audacity and speed. His philosophy was brutally simple: grab the enemy by the nose and kick him in the rear. In the crucible of combat, this philosophy proved devastatingly effective. Patton's reputation for being feared grew from his performance in the Mediterranean theater and reached its apex in the European campaign of 1944 and 1945. Taking command of the Third Army in France, Patton unleashed a campaign of mobile warfare that stunned both his allies and his German opponents. His army advanced faster and farther than any comparable force in military history, covering 600 miles in 2 weeks during the pursuit across France. German commanders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front and seasoned by years of brutal combat, found themselves facing an opponent who fought with a tempo and aggression that matched their own at the height of their power. What made Patton particularly fearsome was his combination of careful logistical planning and violent execution. Despite his reputation as a glory-seeking cavalier, Patton was a meticulous student of logistics, supply, and the mundane details that keep armies moving. He insisted on gasoline when others said there was none, pushed his men when others would have consolidated, and saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in the West, demonstrated Patton's genius at its most acute. When German forces smashed through American lines in the Ardennes in December 1944, creating a crisis that threatened the entire Allied position, Patton accomplished what many thought impossible. He disengaged 3 divisions from active combat, pivoted them 90 degrees, and drove north through winter conditions to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne, all in a matter of days. This maneuver, executed with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of military physics, broke the back of the German offensive and confirmed Patton's status as one of the great captains of the war. German generals, in their post-war interrogations, consistently identified Patton as the Allied commander they most feared. They recognized in him a kindred spirit, a warrior who understood that modern war required not just courage, but a willingness to drive men and machines to their absolute limits. His pearl-handled revolvers, his profanity-laced speeches, and his aristocratic bearing made him a figure of legend, but it was his operational brilliance that made him genuinely feared.
While Patton drove across Europe from the west, another commander was orchestrating operations of even greater scope and devastation from the east. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the son of a shoemaker from Kaluga province, rose through the ranks of the Red Army to become the man who arguably contributed more to Germany's defeat than any other single commander. Born in 1996, Zhukov embodied the brutal meritocracy of Soviet military culture.
He survived Stalin's purges through competence and political acumen, and when war came, he proved himself a master of large-scale operations. His reputation as the man who never lost reflects a career of victories, from the defeat of Japanese forces at Khalkhin Gol in 1939 to the final capture of Berlin in 1945. What made Zhukov feared was not subtlety, but overwhelming force applied with strategic precision. He understood the industrial nature of modern warfare better than almost any of his contemporaries. The German generals who faced him learned to dread the methodical accumulation of Soviet forces, the careful reconnaissance, and the certainty that when Zhukov struck, he would do so with massive superiority in guns, tanks, and men. His defense of Leningrad, his salvation of Moscow in the winter of 1941, and his orchestration of the Stalingrad counteroffensive all demonstrated his ability to operate at the strategic level. Zhukov could see the entire theater of war, could coordinate multiple army groups, and could time his blows for maximum effect. At Kursk in 1943, he correctly predicted where the Germans would strike their summer offensive, prepared defenses in depth, and then launched counteroffensives that began the inexorable Soviet drive westward. The scale of operations Zhukov commanded staggers the imagination. The Battle of Berlin alone involved more than 2 million Soviet troops, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces. German commanders feared Zhukov because he was predictable in only one sense. He would always have more resources than they did, and he would use them without the sentimentality that sometimes constrained Western commanders. Soviet casualties under Zhukov's command were often horrific by Western standards, but he operated within a military culture that measured victory by territorial gain and enemy destruction, not by friendly casualties avoided. This made him a terrifying opponent for German generals who found their tactical skills and operational excellence increasingly irrelevant against an enemy who could absorb losses that would have destroyed any Western army and still keep attacking. From Moscow to Berlin, Zhukov's presence at a sector of the front signaled that a major Soviet offensive was imminent, and German intelligence officers learned to track his movements with the same attention they paid to the concentration of Soviet armor. He was the Soviet Union's fireman, sent to the most critical points of crisis, and invariably he delivered victory. That he accomplished this while navigating the treacherous political waters of Stalin's Soviet Union speaks to capabilities that extended beyond the purely military. In the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front, where entire army groups could be encircled and destroyed, Zhukov proved the master.
The architect of Germany's early victories, the man who more than any other defined how modern mechanized warfare would be conducted, was Heinz Wilhelm Guderian. Born in 1888 in Kulm, then part of Prussia, Guderian served as a staff officer in the First World War and emerged from Germany's defeat convinced that the next war would be won by tanks, not infantry. Throughout the interwar period, while many military establishments clung to traditional notions of warfare, Guderian studied, wrote, and advocated for the concentrated use of armor. His book, Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, laid out the theoretical foundations of what would become known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But Guderian was not merely a theorist, he was a practitioner of genius who would prove his concepts on the battlefields of Poland, France, and Russia. What made Guderian feared was that he revolutionized warfare itself. The speed of German operations in Poland in 1939, and especially in France in 1940, seemed to violate the fundamental assumptions that had governed military thinking since the Western Front of 1914-1918. Guderian's panzer divisions did not merely support infantry advances, they were the spearhead of entirely new operational concepts.
His drive to the Channel coast in May 1940 against the explicit orders of cautious superiors cut the Allied armies in two and led directly to the evacuation at Dunkirk and France's surrender. In 19 days, his panzers covered 240 miles, moving at a tempo that Allied commanders could not match or counter. This was warfare as it had never been seen, fluid, rapid, and decisive. British and French generals, many of them veterans of the previous war, found their carefully prepared defensive positions simply bypassed, their armies encircled before they could react, their command and control paralyzed by the speed of German operations. In the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group drove deep into Russian territory, encircling vast numbers of Soviet troops and advancing to within sight of Moscow. He understood that in modern war, paralysis of the enemy's command structure was more valuable than simple territorial gain. His panzers aimed for headquarters, supply depots, and communication centers, creating chaos in the enemy's rear areas. That Guderian eventually fell out with Hitler over strategy, was dismissed and then recalled, speaks to his independence of mind and his unwillingness to subordinate military reality to political fantasy. German officers who served under him remembered a commander who led from the front, who understood the capabilities and limitations of armored warfare with intimate precision, and who possessed the moral courage to argue with superiors when he believed they were wrong. His legacy extends far beyond the Second World War. Virtually every modern military doctrine for mechanized warfare traces its intellectual lineage back to Guderian's theories and practices. He made armor the dominant arm of mid-20th century warfare, and in doing so, he made himself feared by every commander who had to face German panzers advancing across the horizon.
In the vast expanses of the Pacific, where the war was fought across thousands of miles of ocean and countless islands, another feared commander was orchestrating campaigns of strategic brilliance and theatrical genius. Douglas MacArthur, born in 1880 to a military family of distinction, embodied American military ambition and strategic vision on a scale that matched the theater he commanded. From his desperate defense of the Philippines in 1941-42, through his island-hopping campaign back across the Pacific, to his triumph in Japan, MacArthur proved himself a master of amphibious warfare, coalition management, and strategic planning. His famous promise upon leaving the Philippines, "I shall return," was not merely propaganda, but a statement of strategic intent that he would fulfill with methodical precision. What made MacArthur feared by his Japanese opponents was his ability to think in terms of entire campaigns, not individual battles. He understood that in the Pacific, victory would come to the side that could project power across oceanic distances, coordinate naval, air, and ground forces, and seize positions that could serve as bases for further advances. His Southwest Pacific campaign, conducted in conjunction with Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive, demonstrated operational art at the highest level. MacArthur's strategy of bypassing heavily defended Japanese positions, isolating them, and rendering them irrelevant while advancing toward the Philippines and ultimately Japan, saved countless American lives and accelerated the timetable of victory. At places like Hollandia and in his return to the Philippines at Leyte Gulf, MacArthur coordinated complex amphibious operations involving hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and multiple divisions, executing landings that often achieved complete tactical surprise. Japanese commanders faced with MacArthur's advancing forces found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered, their garrisons bypassed, their defensive plans made obsolete by American forces appearing where they were least expected.
MacArthur's careful study of intelligence, his willingness to take calculated risks, and his ability to maintain pressure along multiple axes simultaneously gave him the initiative throughout the Pacific Campaign. That he was vain, that he was political, that he carefully cultivated his public image, all of this is true, but it does not diminish his strategic accomplishments. He won his theater of war through a combination of military skill and an understanding of the political dimensions of coalition warfare that few commanders could match. His post-war occupation of Japan, marked by wise policies and genuine respect for Japanese culture, demonstrated that his abilities extended beyond purely military matters. To the Japanese generals who opposed him, MacArthur represented an inexorable force, an opponent who commanded resources they could not match, but who also possessed the strategic acumen to use those resources with devastating efficiency.